Well, the more they talked of his honour in their resignation letters, the more they twisted the knife. You're a great man, Jeremy. You're a sincere and honest man. You're a principled man, but we'd prefer an unprincipled liar in your place. Or at least we used to prefer that unprincipled liar who's up in front of the beaks in the Chilcot Inquiry report next week. And, by the way, if we set a few fires here and there, well, maybe it will distract some attention from what's coming up in the Chilcot report. Make no mistake about this. And it's public now with the tweet from Alistair Campbell, Mr. Blair's spin doctor. They are back too. They are in charge of this operation, this mother of all operations, unprecedented in the entire history of the Labour Party, where a carefully planned and coordinated and pre-exit existing plan to bring down the man who not even a year ago, just 9 months ago, was elected in a landslide victory to be the leader of the Labour Party. And irony of irony, on the very day that this coup by the anti-Corbyn plotters began to roll out on the hour, every hour, in front of the media cameras, taking all attention away from the crisis in the Conservative Party, Labour went ahead in the polls. Yes, that's right. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour went ahead of the Conservatives in the polls for the first time. Some disaster. Now, Toby was just reading a news bulletin there in which he quoted an advisor to two former Labour leaders as saying that Corbyn's a turkey and he needs to be dispatched. I forget her name if I ever knew it. But I do know the two Labour leaders to whom she was an advisor, Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman. How did that go? How did those leaderships go? Were they a great success? Are we supposed to wish the Labour Party to emulate the leaders, Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman? You couldn't make this up. They're attacking Corbyn for the fact that 40% of Labour voters voted to leave the EU when they are MPs for constituencies where in one case 70% of the voters voted to leave the EU. So if that's Jeremy's fault, whose fault is it when a Labour MP can count on only 30% of the voters in their own constituencies? The people, the working class people, 2/3 of all tenants, 2/3 of all council house tenants, 2/3 of all housing association tenants voted to leave the EU. Not because Jeremy Corbyn didn't persuade them enough of the wonders of the EU, but because they already knew that there were no wonders. They already knew there was nothing in it for them. They'd had 40 years in the EU, and they were unpersuaded that it was going to get any better. And in fact, in the face of Project Fear, they were unpersuaded that it was going to get any worse. Maybe it will, maybe it won't get worse. In the short term, the medium term, maybe the long term, maybe. But the people who have not voted leave, and the people who have voted to remain. That is the fundamental dichotomy in all the analysis of the EU referendum result. If you had money for the espresso macchiato served by a cheaply paid Romanian waitress, if you had money to hire a cheap Bulgarian nanny, if you had the money to hire a cheap Polish cleaner, well, you're all for the EU. But if you don't have a nanny or a cleaner, and you don't drink espresso macchiato, things looked rather different. And Jeremy Corbyn is not Jesus. He could not, even though his initials are JC, he's not Jesus. He could not persuade the unpersuadable about something that was unsustainable and untenable. Now, we've got some tasty guests, I must say, coming up in the course of the next 3 hours. And the tastiest of them, and he may not be to your taste, as he isn't to mine, is Nigel Farage, the man without whom the show wouldn't be a show. We wouldn't have had a referendum if millions of people had not begun voting for him. He's the man to confound whom David Cameron called this referendum in the first place. Now, what's happening in the Conservative Party is very interesting, and I'm going to be talking to Nigel Farage about that. Because, a little bit to my surprise, it turns out that the Tory leaders of the official Leave campaign don't actually really want to leave at all. It was all just an inner party game for them. It was one half of the Bullingdon Club throwing bread rolls across the dining hall at the other half of the Bullingdon Club. It was a temporary bust-up between Etonian toffs. And now that to their surprise they won, well, they seem to me to be doing everything that they can to make sure that the exit from the failing collection of EU economies is as slow and as incomplete as it's possible to be. And so I'm going to ask Nigel, well, are we exiting or not? Are we leaving the European Union or not? What's going on the Tory benches? Now, before I came in, there was a discussion about the runners and riders, not just for the Labour leadership, to which we shall return, but the Conservative Party's leadership. I had thought that Boris Johnson was a shoe-in. I think I still do. But it does seem to be the case that for whatever reason, there are forces at work to stop Boris Johnson, just as on the Labour side there are many, many forces at work to bring down Jeremy Corbyn. We'll be looking at who will face Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour leadership election, which seems now inevitable, and we'll be looking at who faces Boris Johnson in the Tory party contest, which has actually formally begun. They have to register, I think, by Thursday that they are candidates, and then we're off and running. Tally-ho, chaps! It'll be one toff or another in a red coat on top of a charger, blowing their trumpets, and the very old and very small Conservative Party leadership in the country will get to decide, therefore, who is our next Prime Minister, but not for long, I believe. I said it here on Friday night, let me say it again. It is unconscionable, unacceptable, democratically untenable for an unelected Prime Minister to conduct the crucial negotiations over the next 2 years on the terms, if we leave, of how we leave and what we leave with and to. The new Tory leader will have to go to the country, and moreover, especially as Labour has chosen this minute to tear itself apart, they'd be fools not to. Now, some people still think that we've got a fixed-term Parliament. We don't. We've got a fixed-term Parliament unless Parliament decides otherwise. So, if the new Tory leader says, I insist on putting myself before the electorate, what's Labour going to do? Say no. We don't want an election. We don't want the chance to vote you out. Of course they won't, because they can't. So, we'll have another general election this year. So when I argued that a vote to leave the European Union would disrupt the ruling elites, I had no idea that that disruption would be so great and would be so quickly, swiftly apparent. We'll be talking to someone from Momentum who have turned out thousands of people, I think, in Parliament Square in a demonstration in support of Jeremy Corbyn. We'll be talking to the venerable political editor of the Press Association, Andrew Woodcock, to get a dispassionate view, because mine is a clearly very passionate one. And I want to hear a dispassionate look from Andrew at where we are. And so let's hear from the venerable political editor of the even more venerable Press Association, Andrew Woodcock. Andrew, welcome to the show. They must have been thinking, those who mounted this coup against Jeremy Corbyn, that they would, by force of numbers and pressure and stage management, actually force him to stand down. Because if it does go to a new election for the Labour leadership, Jeremy Corbyn's going to win again. And where will that leave the plotters?
Well, I think there is an awareness amongst Labour MPs that in any election that goes to the party at large, Mr Corbyn is, if he's on the ballot paper, he's certainly likely to win it. He seems to still have strong support amongst the Labour membership. One obstacle that might stand in his way is actually getting his name onto the ballot paper. There's some confusion as to whether he would be required to obtain the nominations. I think it's about 30 to 35 nominations of Labour MPs and MEPs to get his name onto the ballot paper. He insists that he should be on the ballot paper by right of being the incumbent leader. There will be wrangles over that. I'd be surprised if they're able to keep him off. So, I would, as you say, I think the Labour MPs who have decided they no longer want Mr Corbyn as their leader, they've decided that they need the force of numbers to simply show that there's no sizable support from in the Parliamentary Labour Party, in the hope that he will simply say, my time's up, I'll give up and hand over to someone else. He's showing no sign at all of doing that at the moment. And
I'm absolutely certain that he isn't going to do that. I mean, short of a bolt of lightning or the Islington omnibus knocking him over, he definitely is going to stick it out. Let me unpick that caveat that you made, if I may. I've seen legal advice from some of the most eminent counsel, which make it clear enough, as clear as legal advice can ever be, that the incumbent is on the ballot paper where there is an incumbent. If there's a new election, if the incumbent stands down, that's a different matter. But that when someone is contesting the election, the incumbent's name is automatically on the ballot paper. The matter would end in court if somebody tried to keep him off the ballot paper, and he'd have the tremendous advantage of the obvious injustice involved in challenging your leader but not allowing him to actually be on the ballot paper for the members to choose from. That would be a recipe not just for a big bill and a long show trial in the High Court, but it would be a recipe for a split, really, wouldn't it?
Oh, I think yes, certainly. That any attempt to keep him off the ballot paper would raise the possibility of a legal fight, which would be terrible for the party. And I think possibly his opponents within the PLP are hoping that he will look at what they regard as being the good of the party over his own position, and they're hoping that, I think Jess Phillips in her resignation letter said, be the socialist you say you are and do the right thing. Now, for her, the right thing at this point is for him to stand down and allow someone else to take over. He clearly doesn't share that opinion. I think that the problem is that the rule book itself doesn't explicitly state that the incumbent gets onto the ballot paper, because presumably there was never any thought in anyone's mind that the incumbent would have a problem getting the nominations together.
Indeed.
As you say, I mean, it's certain to lead to appalling legal problems if there is a dispute over it.
It's legally axiomatic, according to the advice that I have seen. But leave the legalities aside for a moment. Do you think that this could end in a formal split? You see, I've lived, although you're venerable, I'm older. I lived through the division in 1982 and the split from the SDP, or the SDP split from Labour. I think the plotters are mainly young and probably didn't live through, as adults, that horror story. Do you think that some of them imagine that by the end of all this there'll be effectively two Labour parties, one led by Jeremy Corbyn and one led by another in Parliament?
Well, one of the relatively junior members of the shadow team who stood down, Nick Thomas Simmons, explicitly in his resignation letter to Mr Corbyn, said, if you stay as leader, there is the danger of a split in the party. But that's, to be honest, that's the first time I've seen someone openly discussing that. And speaking to Labour MPs, I don't get the impression that there's appetite for a division in the party and for two separate parties to actually exist, within the House of Commons. Firstly, I suppose because they, some of them are old enough, not so many of them are old enough to remember the SDP, as you say, but those that aren't old enough will certainly have read their history books, and it didn't turn out well for the SDP. In the long term, they were subsumed into Liberal Democrats, and their sort of separate existence as a Social Democrat party, more or less disappeared. Also, there's obviously the question of if you have a separate party, where does it get its funds from? The Labour Party is funded largely by the trade unions, and they're showing, so far most of them are showing loyalty to Mr Corbyn. They want the Labour Party to exist in its existing structures, and any effort to change that would be fraught with danger, because a party with no money doesn't last very long. I think there's always a possibility that if we have a leadership election, if Mr Corbyn is returned, maybe some of his MPs will refuse to take the whip when they return back to the party, to the Commons rather.
Yes, although an early election will concentrate the mind wonderfully on
Indeed,
that,
yes.
Andrew.
Yeah.
I don't want to put ideas in their head, but let me run this scenario past you. As you know, the House of Commons doesn't actually recognise the existence of parties outside the building. The Prime Minister is the man or woman who can count on a majority of members of Parliament, and that need not actually necessarily be the leader of the major political party. So if you had 200 rebel Labour MPs who formed themselves as a group seeking recognition from the Speaker and the House authorities as a parliamentary grouping, and thus claim the title of Leader of the Opposition, the Speaker would almost certainly grant that, because he can only go on the heads on the benches in the building. And with that recognition comes several £million of government support, short money it's called, which is the entitlement of Her Majesty's opposition. So you could actually have, say, Dan Jarvis as the leader of that parliamentary group, and thus asking questions of the Prime Minister every Wednesday at PMQs, and in receipt of the short money.
Well, it's a very intriguing idea. I'm sure that has crossed through the minds of some Labour MPs here, because it does seem to be moving towards a position where there will be more Labour MPs who have renounced their loyalty to Mr Corbyn than those who are still following his commands. And at that point, commands is the wrong word, his instructions, his whip, his position. His whip, yes, indeed.
Well, take a punt, will you, on what the vote's going to be tomorrow. It's a secret ballot, I understand. How many do you think will vote no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn? I would
guess that there will be a majority who will be voting no confidence, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't like to put a number on it, but in a secret ballot, clearly MPs, speaking publicly, are always aware of the danger that their constituency parties might take unkindly to shows of disloyalty, and as always, deselection is something they worry about. In a secret ballot, that's not so much of a concern, obviously, and I would be surprised if he gets through it unscathed tomorrow.
Andrew Woodcock, political editor of the PA, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, the more they talked of his honour in their resignation letters, the more they twisted the knife. You're a great man, Jeremy. You're a sincere and honest man. You're a principled man, but we'd prefer an unprincipled liar in your place. Or at least we used to prefer that unprincipled liar who's up in front of the beaks in the Chilcot Inquiry report next week. And, by the way, if we set a few fires here and there, well, maybe it will distract some attention from what's coming up in the Chilcot report. Make no mistake about this, and it's public now with the tweet from Alistair Campbell, Mr. Blair's spin doctor. They are back too. They are in charge of this operation, this mother of all operations, unprecedented in the entire history of the Labour Party, where a carefully planned and coordinated and pre-exit existing plan to bring down the man who not even a year ago, just 9 months ago, was elected in a landslide victory to be the leader of the Labour Party. And irony of irony, on the very day that this coup by the anti-Corbyn plotters began to roll out on the hour, every hour, in front of the media cameras, taking all attention away from the crisis in the Conservative Party, Labour went ahead in the polls. Yes, that's right. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour went ahead of the Conservatives in the polls for the first time. Some disaster. Now, Toby was just reading a news bulletin there in which he quoted an advisor to two former Labour leaders as saying that Corbyn's a turkey and he needs to be dispatched. I forget her name if I ever knew it. But I do know the two Labour leaders to whom she was an advisor, Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman. How did that go? How did those leaderships go? Were they a great success? Are we supposed to wish the Labour Party to emulate the leaders, Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman? You couldn't make this up. They're attacking Corbyn for the fact that 40% of Labour voters voted to leave the EU when they are MPs for constituencies where in one case 70% of the voters voted to leave the EU. So if that's Jeremy's fault, whose fault is it when a Labour MP can count on only 30% of the voters in their own constituencies? The people, the working class people, 2/3 of all tenants, 2/3 of all council house tenants, 2/3 of all housing association tenants voted to leave the EU. Not because Jeremy Corbyn didn't persuade them enough of the wonders of the EU, but because they already knew that there were no wonders. They already knew there was nothing in it for them. They'd had 40 years in the EU, and they were unpersuaded that it was going to get any better. And in fact, in the face of Project Fear, they were unpersuaded that it was going to get any worse. Maybe it will, maybe it won't get worse. In the short term, the medium term, maybe the long term, maybe. But the people who have not voted leave, and the people who have voted to remain. That is the fundamental dichotomy in all the analysis of the EU referendum result. If you had money for the espresso macchiato served by a cheaply paid Romanian waitress, if you had money to hire a cheap Bulgarian nanny, if you had the money to hire a cheap Polish cleaner, well, you're all for the EU. But if you don't have a nanny or a cleaner, and you don't drink espresso macchiato, things looked rather different. And Jeremy Corbyn is not Jesus. He could not, even though his initials are JC, He's not Jesus. He could not persuade the unpersuadable about something that was unsustainable and untenable. Now, we've got some tasty guests, I must say, coming up in the course of the next 3 hours. And the tastiest of them, and he may not be to your taste, as he isn't to mine, is Nigel Farage, the man without whom the show wouldn't be a show. We wouldn't have had a referendum if millions of people had not begun voting for him. He's the man to confound whom David Cameron called this referendum in the first place. Now, what's happening in the Conservative Party is very interesting, and I'm going to be talking to Nigel Farage about that. Because, a little bit to my surprise, it turns out that the Tory leaders of the official Leave campaign don't actually really want to leave at all. It was all just an inner party game for them. It was one half of the Bullingdon Club throwing bread rolls across the dining hall at the other half of the Bullingdon Club. It was a temporary bust-up between Etonian toffs. And now that to their surprise they won, well, they seem to me to be doing everything that they can to make sure that the exit from the failing collection of EU economies is as slow and as incomplete as it's possible to be. And so I'm going to ask Nigel, well, are we exiting or not? Are we leaving the European Union or not? What's going on the Tory benches? Now, before I came in, there was a discussion about the runners and riders, not just for the Labour leadership, to which we shall return, but the Conservative Party's leadership. I had thought that Boris Johnson was a shoe-in. I think I still do. But it does seem to be the case that for whatever reason, there are forces at work to stop Boris Johnson, just as on the Labour side, there are many, many forces at work to bring down Jeremy Corbyn. We'll be looking at who will face Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour leadership election, which seems now inevitable, and we'll be looking at who faces Boris Johnson in the Tory party contest, which has actually formally begun. They have to register, I think, by Thursday that they are candidates, and then we're off and running. Tally-ho, chaps! It'll be one toff or another in a red coat on top of a charger, blowing their trumpets, and the very old and very small Conservative Party leadership in the country will get to decide, therefore, who is our next Prime Minister, but not for long, I believe. It is unconscionable, unacceptable, democratically untenable for an unelected Prime Minister to conduct the crucial negotiations over the next 2 years on the terms, if we leave, of how we leave and what we leave with and to. The new Tory leader will have to go to the country, and moreover, especially as Labour has chosen this minute to tear itself apart, they'd be fools not to. Now, some people still think that we've got a fixed-term Parliament. We don't. We've got a fixed-term Parliament unless Parliament decides otherwise. So, if the new Tory leader says, I insist on putting myself before the electorate, what's Labour going to do? Say no. We don't want an election. We don't want the chance to vote you out. Of course they won't, because they can't. So, we'll have another general election this year. So when I argued that a vote to leave the European Union would disrupt the ruling elites, I had no idea that that disruption would be so great and would be so quickly, swiftly apparent. We'll be talking to someone from Momentum who have turned out thousands of people, I think, in Parliament Square in a demonstration in support of Jeremy Corbyn. We'll be talking to the venerable political editor of the Press Association, Andrew Woodcock, to get a dispassionate view, because mine is a clearly very passionate one. Andrew, welcome to the show. They must have been thinking, those who mounted this coup against Jeremy Corbyn, that they would, by force of numbers and pressure and stage management, actually force him to stand down. Because if it does go to a new election for the Labour leadership, Jeremy Corbyn's going to win again. And where will that leave the plotters?
Well, I think there is an awareness amongst Labour MPs that in any election that goes to the party at large, Mr Corbyn is, if he's on the ballot paper, he's certainly likely to win it. He seems to still have strong support amongst the Labour membership. One obstacle that might stand in his way is actually getting his name onto the ballot paper. There's some confusion as to whether he would be required to obtain the nominations. I think it's about 30 to 35 nominations of Labour MPs and MEPs to get his name onto the ballot paper. He insists that he should be on the ballot paper by right of being the incumbent leader. There will be wrangles over that. I'd be surprised if they're able to keep him off. So, I would, as you say, I think the Labour MPs who have decided they no longer want Mr Corbyn as their leader, they've decided that they need the force of numbers to simply show that there's no sizable support from in the Parliamentary Labour Party, in the hope that he will simply say, my time's up, I'll give up and hand over to someone else. He's showing no sign at all of doing that at the moment. And
I'm absolutely certain that he isn't going to do that. I mean, short of a bolt of lightning or the Islington omnibus knocking him over, he definitely is going to stick it out. Let me unpick that caveat that you made, if I may. I've seen legal advice from some of the most eminent counsel, which make it clear enough, as clear as legal advice can ever be, that the incumbent is on the ballot paper where there is an incumbent. If there's a new election, if the incumbent stands down, that's a different matter. But that when someone is contesting the election, the incumbent's name is automatically on the ballot paper. The matter would end in court if somebody tried to keep him off the ballot paper, and he'd have the tremendous advantage of the obvious injustice involved in challenging your leader but not allowing him to actually be on the ballot paper for the members to choose from. That would be a recipe not just for a big bill and a long show trial in the High Court, but it would be a recipe for a split, really, wouldn't it?
Oh, I think, yes, certainly. That any attempt to keep him off the ballot paper would raise the possibility of a legal fight, which would be terrible for the party. And I think possibly his opponents within the PLP are hoping that he will look at what they regard as being the good of the party over his own position, and they're hoping that, I think Jess Phillips in her resignation letter said, be the socialist you say you are and do the right thing. Now, for her, the right thing at this point is for him to stand down and allow someone else to take over. He clearly doesn't share that opinion. I think that the problem is that the rule book itself doesn't explicitly state that the incumbent gets onto the ballot paper, because presumably there was never any thought in anyone's mind that the incumbent would have a problem getting the nominations together.
Indeed.
As you say, I mean, it's certain to lead to appalling legal problems if there is a dispute over it.
It's legally axiomatic, according to the advice that I have seen. But leave the legalities aside for a moment. Do you think that this could end in a formal split? You see, I've lived, although you're venerable, I'm older. I lived through the division in 1982 and the split from the SDP, or the SDP split from Labour. I think the plotters are mainly young and probably didn't live through, as adults, that horror story. Do you think that some of them imagine that by the end of all this there'll be effectively two Labour parties, one led by Jeremy Corbyn and one led by another in Parliament?
Well, one of the relatively junior members of the shadow team who stood down, Nick Thomas Simmons, explicitly in his resignation letter to Mr. Corbyn, said, "If you stay as leader, there is the danger of a split in the party." But that's, to be honest, that's the first time I've seen someone openly discussing that. And speaking to Labour MPs, I don't get the impression that there's appetite for a division in the party and for two separate parties to actually exist, within the House of Commons. Firstly, I suppose because they, some of them are old enough, not so many of them are old enough to remember the SDP, as you say, but those that aren't old enough will certainly have read their history books, and it didn't turn out well for the SDP. In the long term, they were subsumed into Liberal Democrats, and their sort of separate existence as a Social Democrat party more or less disappeared. Also, there's obviously the question of if you have a separate party, where does it get its funds from? The Labour Party is funded largely by the trade unions, and they're showing, so far most of them are showing loyalty to Mr. Corbyn. They want the Labour Party to exist in its existing structures, and any effort to change that would be fraught with danger, because a party with no money doesn't last very long. I think there's always a possibility that if we have a leadership election, if Mr. Corbyn is returned, maybe some of his MPs will refuse to take the whip when they return back to the party, to the Commons rather.
Yes, although an early election will concentrate the mind wonderfully on that, Andrew.
Yeah.
I don't want to put ideas in their head, but let me run this scenario past you. As you know, the House of Commons doesn't actually recognise the existence of parties outside the building. The Prime Minister is the man or woman who can count on a majority of members of Parliament, and that need not actually necessarily be the leader of the major political party. So if you had 200 rebel Labour MPs who formed themselves as a group seeking recognition from the Speaker and the House authorities as a parliamentary grouping, and thus claim the title of Leader of the Opposition, the Speaker would almost certainly grant that, because he can only go on the heads on the benches in the building. And with that recognition comes several £million of government support, short money it's called, which is the entitlement of Her Majesty's opposition. So you could actually have, say, Dan Jarvis as the leader of that parliamentary group, and thus asking questions of the Prime Minister every Wednesday at PMQs, and in receipt of the short money.
Well, it's a very intriguing idea. I'm sure that has crossed through the minds of some Labour MPs here, because it does seem to be moving towards a position where there will be more Labour MPs who have renounced their loyalty to Mr. Corbyn than those who are still following his commands. And at that point, commands is the wrong word, his instructions, his whip, his position. His whip, yes, indeed.
Well, take a punt, will you, on what the vote's going to be tomorrow. It's a secret ballot, I understand. How many do you think will vote no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn? I
would guess that there will be a majority who will be voting no confidence, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't like to put a number on it, but in a secret ballot, clearly MPs, speaking publicly, are always aware of the danger that their constituency parties might take unkindly to shows of disloyalty, and as always, deselection is something they worry about. In a secret ballot, that's not so much of a concern, obviously, and I would be surprised if he gets through it unscathed tomorrow.
Andrew Woodcock, political editor of the PA, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Listen, this guy's a nightmare. He's not a great guy, folks.
Was that really Donald Trump? It could have been. I'm George Galloway. Now listen, my old mate Jeremy Corbyn is still speaking in Parliament Square. I don't know about you, but I'd quite like to hear him.
Wealthy majority, otherwise known as rolling back of the state and rolling back of the role of the community in the provision of services. I don't want to be somebody that says to young people, sorry, you're not going to have it as good as we did because the nation can't afford it, and sorry, your children, our grandchildren, are not going to have it as good as you are because the nation can't afford it, and we then cascade inequality and poverty and debt down the generations? Or are we to say that the brilliance of technology, the brilliance of science, the brilliance of engineering can, should and must be the tool and the opportunity for the redistribution of wealth, for the opportunities of equality, and that we develop an economy that excites people and mobilises a whole generation that have been told they only have to look forward to a lifetime of debt in the future. That's why the movement we now have in Britain, the movement for social justice and the movement for equality, is so strong, why it reaches out so broadly. Because we learn from each other, because we learn from the values of each other, because we learn from the history of each other, because we learn from the tolerance of each other, for whatever grouping, ethnicity, faith we happen to be. That is where unity comes in, and that is what makes us strong. Don't let the media divide us. Don't let those people who wish us ill divide us. Stay together, strong and united, for the kind of world we want to live in. Thank you very much.
Well, that was Jeremy Corbyn there.
That was indeed Jeremy Corbyn. I've known him well for almost 40 years. I sat next to him, literally, in fact, most of the time, for almost 30 years in Parliament. And I know at least one thing about him better than those who have sought to destroy his leadership today. I know that he's not a quitter. I know that he's a man who will stay the course, and the members will now decide whether Jeremy Corbyn stays or goes. Now, another man made of metal is the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, Nigel Farage, with whom I had a very brief alliance in the run-up to the referendum result, but without whom there wouldn't have been a referendum, as I said earlier. Nigel, are you on the line?
George, good evening.
Good evening to you. Now, I've been saying tonight, Nigel, I don't know if you have the same view, we'll soon see, that the Conservative leaders of the official Leave campaign are giving the impression that they didn't really mean it. And so I'm here to ask you, are we really exiting the European Union or not?
Well, George, the reason that we had an alliance together in the Grassroots Out campaign, and the reason that we put our own bid together, is that we actually meant it. And we were suspicious from the very beginning. There was talk about double referendums, about voting no to get a better deal. I have to confess, George, I was euphoric on Friday morning. You know, one of the biggest beatings the establishment has ever taken in British political history. And here I am on Monday evening, a little bit nervous, because I think Boris is backtracking. We have Conservative MEPs like Daniel Hannan backtracking. And I'm worried, and we're just going to have to keep the pressure on them. We really are.
Yes, although of course there's now the massive distractions of leadership campaigns in both of the major parties. In fact, you and I are the only two political leaders in the land, it seems, that are not yet under leadership challenge. Although in your case, there's always a bit of a rumble. Nigel, what can we do to keep the pressure on? After all, you're not in Parliament, I'm not in Parliament. In a way, the establishment are still in charge of the process, even though the people delivered them quite a thrashing last Thursday.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, the results caused turmoil. It's got rid of the Prime Minister. It's got rid of the British Commissioner. I'm even told Mr. Juncker now, the head of the Commission, is under serious pressure, and Jeremy Corbyn's having a miserable time. So, you know, things have been shaken up. The question is really back with the voters. You know, if they're let down, then maybe at by-elections or the next general election, they will continue to vote against the establishment. I mean, the one big irony, George, in all of this, is that if Jeremy Corbyn had spoken out for a Leave vote, the Labour Party would now be in a great position with the British public.
Indeed, if he had, or even if he'd taken the Harold Wilson line of saying, well, Labour members are free to speak their own mind, and here's my mind. It's the same as it's been for the last 45 years. Then he would have been in a much stronger position. Because, of course, it's the Remainiacs that are now trying to destroy him because he didn't quite do a passionate enough job persuading people of the wonders of the EU. When, of course, Jesus, I know he's JC, but Jesus himself could not have persuaded the poor and the workless and the people under such pressure out there in post-industrial Britain, in the wasteland. Nobody could have persuaded them of the wonders of the European Union, because for them those wonders don't exist.
No, and of course, this is the irony, isn't it, that this battle that is going on within Labour, and the Labour parliamentarians, Blairite, many of them, of course, who want to replace Corbyn, don't seem to understand that even if they do, and we get another Remainiac, as you call them, actually, Labour's electoral prospects in many of those post-industrial parts of the north of the Midlands, and South Wales and Scotland for that matter, I tell you what, George, they look doomed to me.
Well, I mean, there's a real danger and a real irony that many of the leading coup plotters are members of parliament for constituencies that themselves voted overwhelmingly to leave.
Yes, that's right. And you know, I don't know. I've got a funny feeling about this. You know, when people like Stephen Kinnock, people like David Lammy say we should ignore the will of the people in this referendum, just maybe at the next election they're going to be in for a huge shock, and maybe that seismic wave that we felt on Friday morning could continue for some years to come.
Well, there's been a petition got up, of course, which isn't worth the paper it isn't written on, because it's an electronic petition. Turns out that 39,000 people living in Vatican City appended their names to it. But however many have signed it, the idea that you could get a petition to overturn the result of a referendum in which 33 million people voted, and we won by 1.25 million of a majority, I mean, this is maniac. This is re-maniac.
Yeah, no, it is. And as I keep telling people, it was never supposed to be the best of three. You know, it was a referendum that everybody made clear, including David Cameron, using 9 million quid's worth of our money to put a leaflet through every door. We said on the last page, this is it. Whatever you decide is what the result is. So let's ignore petitions. Let's ignore protests. Let's understand that all of this is backed up by the multinationals, the merchant banks, and indeed big politics, because they're upset we've taken their toys away from them. So now what we have to do, and certainly what I have to do, is to see who is going to stand for the next Tory leader, and we'll know on Thursday what the shortlist is. And I shall certainly be encouraging people to vote for the most pro-Brexit of those contenders.
I mean, let's assume for a minute that Boris wins it. I was making the point earlier, which seemed to have been forgotten during the campaign, that when the journalists were on his doorstep on the night that he announced that he'd be campaigning to leave, no one knew whether he was going to come out and say one thing or the other. And indeed, he had written 2 columns for the Daily Telegraph the next morning, one for and one against staying in the EU. Do you think that the people who are going to elect him, if they do, are going to put up with this kind of stasis, a period of years in which we get bogged down in all the technicalities? Meanwhile, we still comply with each and every bad thing about the European Union that Johnson urged people to vote leave as a result. I mean, were all these things so bad, but we're going to go on doing them year after year?
I mean, Boris has the chance to prove in the course of the next couple of weeks and months whether he's a great man or whether he is one of those politicians who gets blown around with the wind, short-term public opinion, and being lobbied by his own party. Let's hope he shows us that he's a man of metal. I don't know whether he is. He's got his chance to prove it. But frankly, I think a lot of backbench Tories just simply would not put up with the Leave vote not being honoured. And I just think, George, there are all sorts of ways. You know, we could find at the next general election, there could be an alliance of people from different political parties campaigning simply on the one issue that we must leave.
That's a possibility, and the Liberal Democrats have said, in fact, that their campaign is going to be to rejoin. Now, my last question to you, because I know you want to get away to the football, is this. If the European Union continues in its current trajectory, is there going to be a European Union in 3 years' time for the Liberals to take us back into, or for Nicola Sturgeon to try and persuade the Scottish people that they should leave Britain and join the Eurozone?
I can't tell you how long it's going to take, but I can tell you that the European Union has failed everybody. It is dying. Right across, from north to south to east to west, parties on the left, the right and the centre who are Eurosceptic are gaining in momentum. And just as sure as we've scored this great victory, you know, for the ordinary people, the little people in the United Kingdom, there's more to come. And I anticipate referendums on leaving coming up in Denmark, the Netherlands and other countries. So either way, at some point in time, this project's dead. I just hope that we don't prolong the agony.
Okay, here's a quick question on Twitter for you. Ask Nigel what he thinks of Scottish Indy 2. As I think, as things stand, the Scottish people are not getting what we voted for. What's your take on that?
I get a bit cheesed off with the use of this word independence. The United Kingdom last Thursday night voted for independence. If she has a second referendum, she's actually asking the Scots to vote against independence and effectively sign up as a province of a European state with the euro. We need to change the language in Scotland to get through to people that the SNP are perpetrating a massive, massive con on people.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much indeed for joining us when England are struggling against the mighty Iceland on television at the same time. Many thanks indeed, the leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage. Now, well, let's recap on one or two of the things that Nigel Farage said. He concurred, in my view, though not as strongly, I think, as I feel it, that the current Tory runners and riders are actually one variant or another of people who actually didn't mean it when they campaigned for exit from the European Union. They have something else in mind. First of all, a long period of very detailed negotiation, with the outcome something like Norway, where you are not actually in the European Union, you don't actually participate in the meetings of the European Union, but you continue to pay them the money and you continue to follow all of their rules, including the rules on free movement of labour. Now let me just say something about my stand on that. I am myself an immigrant. I am a child of immigrants, at least a grandchild of immigrants from Ireland. The issue of refugees and the issue of immigration are two separate issues. Every person has a duty to a refugee, and they have to take their fair share of refugees, not least when you're in a country that's causing the flight of most of those refugees to begin with. But every country, every state, has the right to control the numbers of people who are coming into their country to join the labour market. What I'm against is not the free movement of people. I would have people being free to move and move everywhere. But what we can't have is unlimited changes to increases in the labour supply, because that can only lead to one thing. If you have an unlimited number of people with the right to come and work in your country, that can only drive down the wages of those of whatever colour who are working here, can only mean more competition for work for the workers already living here. And that's a liberal dream, maybe, but it isn't a dream of anyone who regards themselves as a leader of the working class movement, as a leader of the labour movement. And that at least has begun to enter the language of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and other left-wing figures in the Labour Party. They have accepted that you cannot have, in a capitalist society, free movement of labour, because the only way that the traffic will come is one way. The people who are struggling in the poorest countries in Europe will come to join the labour market in the richest countries in Europe. Now, if you had the kind of government and the kind of society that I fight for, you would deal with that through legally buttressed trade union rights, a high minimum wage, legal requirement on employers to negotiate fairly with their workers and not to undercut their workers with cheaper labour, and a whole string of things that would mitigate what happens as a result of that increase in the supply of labour. But when you don't have that kind of a government, when you don't have that kind of a society, all you're doing by participating, as Norway does, in the free movement of labour, all you're doing is storing up further trouble for the workers of all colours who are already living and working here. Now, where am I? I'm going to take some calls in a minute, but I want to read these messages first. Andy Hardy says, just listen to Corbyn at the London demo. He's often criticised by people who say he's not a good leader. 1. Show me a good leader in today's political climate. You'll be hard-pressed. Well, thanks a lot, Andy. 2. I like his style. He's quiet, but he is calm and doesn't bark and shout like the rest of the world. Andy, are you talking about me? The world is full of noise. People shouting their opinions online, following only those who agree with them. Andy, this is a pretty root and branch attack on me, if you ask me. And here is, well, no, I've read that one. I read this one out to Farage. It's from Lisbon, 67. Hail, hail, a good Celtic man. I must say, we seem to have a lot of callers and listeners in Scotland. Maybe it's just when I'm on. Now, we're being followed by, I think, a good few thousand people on live stream. Yesterday and today has been a parade of MPs that nobody had ever heard of, resigning from jobs that nobody knew they ever had. I made a very short video to that effect on Facebook. It's reached about 1.5 million people in just over 24 hours and has been watched by I think more than 300,000 people. So if you go to my Facebook page, then you might enjoy me making that point a little more length. Let's take caller Tom in Gloucestershire on the subject of the EU and freedom of movement and so on, about which I've just been talking to Nigel Farage. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, George. Great pleasure to speak to you.
And to you, sir. Go ahead. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I thought what you were saying just before the break really hits the nail on the head. There's been a lot of comment about immigration in the last week or so and in the campaign. And for me, it isn't the immigrants to blame. It's not, you can't blame the immigrants.
No, of course not. They're acting entirely irrationally in coming here.
It's the system.
Do you know what the average wage per hour in Bulgaria is? £1 per hour.
Precisely. Well, the bees will always go to the honey, won't they?
Yeah, you could hardly blame a worker for that. I'd do the same if I was living in Bulgaria.
Precisely. So it's the origins of the system, the accountability of the scheme, and the scheme itself, which I think is the problem. And I think that the British people last Thursday suddenly realised that the only way that they could have an influence on freedom of movement wasn't through a general election, it was through voting leave in the referendum. That was their last chance of actually derailing that policy. And it just goes to show what the core argument about coming out of the EU is about. It's about accountability.
Yeah.
It's about the lawmakers who elects them. I mean, it's the judges who can overturn laws that have been made in this country, that's wrong. It's the commission who are appointed who can make laws that affect you and I, and we can't get them out on polling day. That is where the central argument was. Now, I am currently a Liberal Democrat. My membership has expired. But when I heard that they were going to disregard last Thursday's referendum result and campaign for going back into Europe, I just couldn't believe my ears. Liberal Democrat means you accept a democratically arrived decision. And I find it a bit of a paradox with the party. They advocate an elected House of Lords, which is a revising chamber that actually reviews potential legislation, throws it back to the Commons, as you know, and says, hey, have a look at this. We think you should move in a different direction. But even then, Parliament has sovereignty with the Parliament Act. What the Liberals turned a blind eye to is the unelected commissioners who can make direct laws which affect us, which we can't account for, and the judges. They defend that. So that is a very difficult position for me because I have campaigned for the party. And I must admit, I think Nigel and you are quite right, actually, in what you're saying tonight, that if we do get an election, there needs to be a coming together of political people who...
Well, I do think that if the Liberal Democrats choose to rejoin the EU party at the general election, they, depending on when that general election is, if it's in 3-4 months, maybe they'll gain something from that. But if it's in 4 years or 3.5 years, it'll be a further wipeout for the Liberal Democrats, because nobody really loves the EU except the leaders of the Liberal Democrats and those who are profiting from it in wages, George, or other things.
Well, George, I'm the son of a former dairy farmer, and I think back to the EU's Commission's decision to abolish the Milk Marketing Board. I know this is going off as a tangent a bit, but it was a directive coming from the Commission at Brussels because the Milk Marketing Board was a monopoly, and it had to go. And our then Conservative government gold-plated that regulation, and basically the dairy farming industry, which was viable then, was thrown to the wolves of the market. And ever since then, you've seen the diminution of dairy farming. I'm working in a valley at the moment, which every farm around here had a herd of cows 30 years ago, 20 years ago. There's not one herd left. It's totally unrecognisable. Now, if that had been put up by our government, we could challenge it. We could have thrown it out by a democratic process. But because it came direct from the EU Commission, we were obliged to accept it. And ever since then, I'm not saying it's the total reason why dairy...
No, I mean, predatory supermarkets and so on have had quite a lot to do with that. But the key point in what you've just said is that nobody could have done anything about it. You could have elected anybody as your MP, and all the farmers and the farming interests could have elected anybody to power, and they wouldn't have been able to change anything. Because these are directives from unelected, irremovable organisations. Listen, Tom, it's been a pleasure to talk to you in Gloucestershire, and stay tuned and call me any time. Well, just as I was telling you that the parade of names you've never heard of, resigning from jobs you never knew they had, I thought it had come to an end, but a news flash came up that Nick Dakin had resigned from the shadow cabinet. Now, I can tell you that I spent almost 30 years in the House of Commons and almost 40 years in the Labour Party. I have never heard of Nick Dakin. If he was sitting opposite me now, getting ready to read the weather report, I wouldn't know who he was. But these carefully choreographed resignations have been deliberately staged, pre-planned, with a website already up and running, in order to do the maximum damage to their own party. It is a self-disfiguring act, because Jeremy Corbyn isn't going to stand down. If they challenge him, he's going to fight them. If he fights them, he's going to defeat them. And then all they will have achieved is waste months of time in which their primary duty of defending the people that elected them will have been entirely abandoned and neglected. There have now been 35 resignations. 35. All but one or two of them of absolute non-entities. Listen, I just looked at the shadow cabinet of 1973. James Callaghan, Roy Jenkins, Dennis Healy, Tony Benn, Michael Foot, Barbara Castle, Richard Crossman, Richard Crossland. I could go on, believe me. On and on and on. Every one of them could have been a prime minister. That was the Labour shadow cabinet in 1973. You look at that list of 35 names that have now quit and tell me anyone on it who would have been other than a research officer for those giants that were in the shadow cabinet in 1973. And one or two of them might have been taken on as a bar steward. Martin O'Byrne, I can't quite read it. Martin anyway says rumours of cross-party alliance filling the shadow cabinet. Caroline Lucas as shadow energy secretary. A can of worms. Is this possible? Likely. I hadn't heard that rumour, but it's a very, very good idea. If Caroline Lucas becomes the Labour Party's shadow energy secretary, I think that will be a very important and significant development. In fact, it was ridiculous that Labour stood in Brighton against Caroline Lucas, one of the most popular progressive people in the country. And who would have benefited from her defeat if it had happened? Of course, it didn't happen. So that's a rumour that we're hearing, and I think it's quite an interesting one. Here's another from Jordan. George, I love the show. I think if Corbyn was to be replaced in the Labour Party with someone who was heavily in the Remain camp, for example, Alan Johnson or Hilary Benn, then the North is left to UKIP. Just wondered your thoughts on this. That's from Jordan in Ramsgate. Well, I think it's a very shrewd observation, and I don't think just in the North. I think if Nigel Farage has a dream, it is that the next leader of the Labour Party is a Remainiac, all gung-ho for the European Union, maybe even prepared to play footsie with the possibility of denying the electorate's decision in the referendum, maybe even someone who wants a second referendum on this matter. If Labour chose someone other than Corbyn, and that's the kind of political line that they had, then Labour would be committing electoral suicide, and Nigel Farage would be overwhelmingly the gainer from it. David Fowler says, I voted Leave. I just hope the UK Parliament will stop Nicola keeping us, Scotland, in the EU. That's David in Glasgow, and he's absolutely correct about that. And let me just roll out some thoughts on that. First of all, 1.25 million people in Scotland, despite the fact that every single political party, everyone, was campaigning for a Remain vote, 1.25 million people in Scotland voted Leave. And by the way, 36% of SNP voters voted Leave, which is roughly the statistic of Labour voters who voted Leave in the election. But instead of anyone calling for Nicola Sturgeon to resign, she's being hailed as the all-conquering hero. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, if she calls Indy Ref 2, then she has a double dunt to pull off. She has to persuade the Scottish people, just a couple of years after they decided otherwise, to leave Britain, a union that they can elect and unelect and join a European Union that they don't elect and cannot unelect. But more importantly, as is now accepted by them, an independent Scotland applying to join the EU would have to accept the criteria that independent Scotland, if it was allowed into the EU, would have to join the Eurozone. How's that going, Nicola? How's the Eurozone going? You're going to persuade people to pull out of Britain and join the EU and join the Eurozone, and you're going to call it independence? What kind of independence will you be enjoying under the absolute domination of the European Central Bank in all fiscal and economic matters? Now, I think that's quite a big ask. And by the way, there was an opinion poll today which said that only 46% of people in Scotland want a second referendum. So 54% at this point in time, before the argument has even really begun, don't want a second referendum. So you've got a triple lock here. You've got 3 hurdles to get over. You've got to persuade people that so soon after the last one, you want to have another Indie ref. Secondly, you want to persuade them in that Indie ref to leave England and Wales and team up with Slovenia and Slovakia, thousands of miles away, speaking a different language, with different economic interests, with a different culture, a different history. That's quite a big ask. And then thirdly, you tell them, and by the way, we won't be able to use the pound anymore. We'll have to join the euro. Well, I think that Scottish people are quite famously good with money. Scottish people are quite smart with money. And I don't think it will be easy to persuade the Scots to join the euro, because they've all got eyes to see what it has achieved in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, and elsewhere. Now, in the early hours of the morning, on Sunday morning, when I became aware of the Hilary Benn mutiny, which led to Jeremy Corbyn dismissing him when he admitted that he had been ringing round the shadow cabinet and organising a mass resignation. I described it as a Ramsay MacDonald moment. Ramsay MacDonald was the #1 traitor in Labour history. It was said, though he had been a very popular leader of the Labour Party, that when he crossed the floor and effectively joined the Tories in a national government, that Labour people all over the country turned his photograph to face the wall. I suspect that something like that will be the fate of Hilary Benn. But I might be wrong, and I'm deferring to a man who knows even more about history than me. He is Professor of Political History at the University of Nottingham, Professor Stephen Fielding. Professor Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the build-up, yes.
Tell me this, is this unprecedented in Labour history? 35 or 36 resignations of front bench people in order to force a leader out?
It's unprecedented in the scale, obviously, and it's unprecedented in the protracted nature of it. But of course, many Labour leaders, particularly those in government, have faced not dissimilar discontents within their shadow or their cabinets. Tony Blair had a bit of a problem, and Tom Watson was involved in trying to get him out in favour of Gordon Brown, of course. So this is not unusual, but the scale of it within that group of MPs is, and of course the other unprecedented element is the role of the members in the country, and the disparity between, or the apparent disparity between the MPs and what they think and what, at least what we think until recently, what many members think about the leader.
That's a good point, because when I was first active in Labour politics in the very early 1970s, the MPs were in complete command of their destiny. The members didn't have a vote. Members of Parliament did not have to be subject to reselection. The leader of the party could be elected in an afternoon, because it all took place within the Palace of Westminster in a committee room. People went in. Indeed, I even recall the election in 1963 of Harold Wilson. I was very young, but I remember my parents hanging on every word on the television on it. But that all changed. Just explain, if you would, to the listeners when that changed and as a result of what it changed.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. Up until 1981, I think I'm right in saying,
you are.
The leader of the party was exclusively elected by MPs. And as a consequence of pressure from the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, that is with us still, and others, we got a leadership college in which the MPs had, I think it was 40%. The members, I think, had 30, and the trade unions had 30. So Labour had a college of like that, and that's the college that also elected Tony Blair in 1994.
Indeed.
And that has changed subsequently under, since it was Ed Miliband who was the first one to be elected in a slightly different manner. And of course, that's been slightly tweaked with the election, or prior to the election of Jeremy Corbyn, in which initially MPs are the ones that decide, who's to be nominated, and then whoever's nominated by, now I think it's 35 MPs and MEPs, and then they put those candidates to be decided by the members. So that's where we are now. That's how Jeremy Corbyn got elected, because of course, although he couldn't get the requisite number of genuine supporters, there were some that thought the left needed a place in the leadership election, even though they didn't think Corbyn had any chance of winning, and so nominated him. So yeah, this is a situation, and it is a unique one, because it has clearly put the MPs, the majority of MPs, against the majority of members over the merits of the leader. And I don't know that this has been the case with any political party. Maybe we'll get it when if Boris Johnson becomes leader, because there's a lot of Conservative MPs who don't like him.
Well, it's a good point. It's a very good point you make, Professor, because look at this potential scenario, that the members of the Tory party in the country are itching to vote for the blonde one, but the MPs who choose the shortlist of two, what about if they didn't put him on the shortlist? That would be quite a party.
That would be, but I think he's going to get on the shortlist. I think that of which we're certain, but certainly a lot of MPs will have very serious misgivings about Boris Johnson. But the merit of Boris Johnson, so far as even his opponents are at least concerned at this point in time, is that they hope that he will deliver a general election victory. And this is the problem for Jeremy Corbyn, because the vast majority of MPs, and even people like Owen Smith, who resigned today, who is not, by any definition of the term, a Blairite, just don't think that he can.
Well, one thing's certain, that Corbyn is not going to be bullied out. He's going to stay the course. I never doubted it for a second, and we've just watched him on news making it clear that he'll go all the way. At this stage, then, who do you think? Will there be one candidate against him, which would seem to me to be the sensible thing for the people that don't want him to do? Or will there be, again, a plethora of different anti-Corbyn MPs?
Well, obviously, Jeremy Corbyn's election it certainly took me by surprise, and it took the vast majority of MPs by surprise. So he certainly won't be getting the support of the likes of Margaret Beckett or others now. But I think yes, I've no idea who they will cohere around. But one person will be standing against Jeremy Corbyn. I imagine there have been talks about who this person is, but I don't know who that would be. But yes, but their hope would be that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't get on the ballot.
No, that's a non-starter, Professor. Here I can help you with, because I have greater expertise on that. the incumbent is automatically on the ballot paper. There is a very expensive Queen's Counsel opinion to that effect, and it's backed by other QCs. Quite apart from being a democratic outrage if by such a device the actual leader, 1 year elected, was kept off a ballot by such a manoeuvre. That would be a recipe for very serious split. But it won't happen because the matter would then go to the courts, and I'm absolutely confident that the Council's opinion, expensively procured, would triumph in the court, and the opponents of Corbyn would have been made to look like undemocratic manoeuvrers trying to deny the members the right even to choose Corbyn again.
Well, I think you're right. There's first of all, legal matters. I mean, there are various people who've given different legal opinions. It's up in the air. But if it goes to the courts, maybe the NEC decides, and again, that's still up in the air. But I think, if you're talking about the long-term future of the Labour Party, then Jeremy Corbyn probably should be on the ballot. But then it makes it even more important who that person who is opposing Corbyn, who that person is. And I can't think of anybody off the top of my head, or even having thought about it for some time, who would be a credible alternative, given the kinds of people who are Labour members. And at least the last time they were asked by an opinion poll organisation, and of course we know how accurate they can be, but he'd actually increased in support earlier this year compared to when he was elected. So the act of the MPs is one of, I think, desperation, more than a coup, and which I don't agree with the term. It's all constitutional. None of it's illegal, but it's an act of desperation, because I think they thought, well, the election's going to be in 2020. We don't like him. We'd like to get rid of him, but we're just going to let the next few years show that Jeremy Corbyn can't win, and that might persuade some members to change their mind. And that gave them a few years. But the whole referendum vote, the prospect of an election in October, and I think they've decided, rather than just sit in our seats, we need to do something. But it has lots of risks, and you could still end up with Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader.
And then what? I mean, having done all this, and then you end with Jeremy Corbyn as leader, how do you show your face? How do you show your face in front of him?
Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously Jeremy Corbyn spent most of his time as an MP voting against his own party and not really engaging with the rest of his parliamentary colleagues. So, but when you've got, over 100 or 150, the vast majority of MPs in the same position, I don't honestly know. It's an incredible prospect, and not one that would serve the Labour Party well. I agree with you. I never thought that Jeremy Corbyn was going to go voluntarily. He hasn't stuck around as an MP on the backbenches voting down his leaders and the policies that they adhered to over many, many decades, to find himself in this position and just give up.
Yeah.
But I think some people might have thought he was going to, but I think you're right. This could go all the way to the members again, and then it's down to the members. And have they changed their opinions on Jeremy Corbyn? Has the referendum suggested some doubts to them? We don't know.
Well, I know his initials are JC, but it would have had to have been the other JC that was out campaigning in the poor north of the country amongst council house tenants and housing association tenants. It would have had to be the other JC that was pressing the case for the wonders of the European Union to get people to vote for remaining in the EU.
Absolutely, there are some severe limitations on the ability of anyone to have pulled that one around. But I think, the people who have resigned today and yesterday, they're a mixed bag. They're not all, however we define Blairites, and I think they've felt genuinely kind of betrayed by what they've seen and what they've heard about how Jeremy Corbyn pursued his side of the Remain campaign, and Alan Johnson, apparently at the parliamentary party meeting, he's of course no friend of Jeremy Corbyn to start with, but the leader of the Labour In campaign was apparently extremely angry about all the machinations and the lack of support, and even the attempt to undermine the Labour in campaign, not necessarily by Jeremy Corbyn, but by people around Jeremy Corbyn, and we know that means Seamus Mill and others. So I think there's some genuine anger that it was such a narrow result, and it was such an important defining decision, one way or the other. And the vast majority of MPs and also many activists, I'm to declare myself, I'm a Labour member, and I've been out, canvassing and doing things for the in campaign.
Now, I've been struggling to get on to my next subject, which is the extraordinary political battle that has now opened in the United States, which I have followed in every close detail. I put my cards on the table. I very much hoped that Bernie Sanders would be the Democratic Party nominee. He shares many, actually, of the characteristics of Jeremy Corbyn, whom I also support in British politics. But Bernie, despite a magnificent fight and gaining many millions of votes in the primary season and raising many, many millions of dollars in small donations from ordinary people, didn't quite make it. The odds were stacked against him because of the anti-democratic nature of the Democratic Party's electoral system, the creation of so-called superdelegates who are really party grandees and placemen and women who support the establishment candidate. And that establishment candidate has emerged as the yet uncrowned but certain Democratic Party contender, Hillary Rodham Clinton, whom I must say I have a very, very low opinion of. But here's the rub. The Republicans have chosen Donald Trump. What's a man to do faced with that dichotomy? Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, which one is the greater danger to the world? Well, there are many people who believe that it's Clinton who's the greater danger to the world, but that Trump is perhaps the greater danger to the people of the United States itself. But that's not our job to decide. It's a matter for the American people. But if you asked me, I'd say vote for the Green Party candidate, Dr. Jill Stein. She's running. She's a third-party candidate. She's a person of the greatest integrity. But unfortunately, she's got no chance of winning. So let's hear from a man who knows better. He's Scott Stiegler. He's a radio host at 770 KKOB in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we call Saul normally, but we're calling Scott tonight. Scott Stiegler, welcome to the show.
Thank you, George. Good to be here.
Just tell us where it stands at the moment, would you? Hillary is definitely the candidate for the Democrats, and Trump is definitely for the Republicans, or might the conventions contain one or two last-minute hiccups?
Well, George, I would be very surprised if something happened to upend either one of those two candidates. I'm sure that there's movements afoot, especially on the Republican side, to oust Donald Trump. But I just don't see that happening. The public outcry would be huge at this point.
Yes, I mean they'd be kissing goodbye the presidential election, but maybe some of the Republicans think that they've already kissed it goodbye by Trump emerging as the leading candidate.
Well, there are some certainly that feel that way. Again, I think what we're seeing, across the globe, and you all have experienced it here in just the last week, is people rising up and saying, "Hey, we want our country to be our country like it was, 15, 20, 25 years ago." And I think there's enough of those people out there that if you shunned their candidate, if you pushed aside their candidate who won it, by fair and square, I think there would be a lot of pushback, and I just don't think that would be productive for the party one way or the other.
And the only thing that could stop Hillary, I would think, would be an indictment. The FBI reportedly have a potential indictment ready to serve, but that would have to get past the Obama administration's Justice Department, which doesn't seem likely.
No, it doesn't seem likely. I think most of us who are on, the anti-Hillary bandwagon would say that if any of us had done what she had done, we would be in jail already. But having said that, I think to indict a presidential candidate mid-election would be very surprising, to say the least. There are some who are speculating that maybe something might come about after she was elected president, but I kind of doubt that you'll ever see Hillary Clinton in handcuffs.
So it's Clinton versus Trump almost certainly. How would that go, Scott, in your opinion?
Well, I still think that that's very much to be determined. You see some of the polls sort of going Hillary Clinton's way right now, but those things tend to change from any given week, and I would not undersell the American public's anger, frustration with government as is, with an establishment type of candidate. Hillary Clinton's been in the news for better part of 25 or 30 years now, and I just think that there's a significant number of people who want to see some kind of change. So even though the polls lean her way right now, I certainly would not be surprised to see that change.
Wouldn't it be a choice between a fool and a knave? I have no doubt and no problem in agreeing with you that Hillary Clinton is a knave. But is it really better to be governed by a fool than a knave?
It kind of depends on how you look at Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump says a lot of things that are bombastic and kind of gets under people's skin the way that he says things and does things. But he has been a brilliant businessman, and he has done a lot of things that have that you can look at from a positive angle too. So I guess it all depends on your perspective.
Has he really been a brilliant businessman? You know better than me, but I read somewhere that if he'd left the money his father bequeathed him in the bank and never done a day's work, he'd actually be more wealthy than he is now.
Well, he's had some, he's had some of the well-documented bankruptcies, but I think generally people consider Donald Trump to be a very solid businessman. And the other thing that I think people look at, when they look at Donald Trump, their opinion of Donald Trump is that he places America first. Again, very much like the nationalistic thing going on in your country right now. Do we want to sort of embrace this whole everybody for everybody kind of mentality, or do we want to live in a country that is what many people here consider to be the greatest nation on earth? And I think that's the chord that he's striking, and striking it fairly well with a number of people. And I think now people have to either get over the fact that he's kind of outspoken and bombastic, or they're going to have to just say that we don't want that and try to come up with the alternative.
So if you were a betting man, Scott, and I know that nobody in New Mexico is, would your money be on Clinton or Trump?
I think right now I'm going to have to. I know this isn't good radio. I'm going to have to sit the fence at this point. I don't know where I would put my money right now. Unfortunately, I don't have to put my money down right now because the windows are still open right until November the 8th.
Yeah.
But right now I would say that Hillary Clinton probably has a little bit of an edge. But
that could change.
I wouldn't put a dime I found in my couch on her right now.
Okay. Scott Stiegler in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Say hi to Saul for me, would you? We're big fans. We're big fans.
We see him fairly frequently.
Really? Is he out and about shooting the show, yeah?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
We just love that show, man. Let's call Saul. Thanks very much, Scott. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, George.
That's Scott Stiegler, a host on 770 KKOB. Don't the radio stations have such wonderful names in the United States? Now, we need to, of course, find. Can I just give note to my producers? We had a guy called John Le Boutillier who was a former Republican congressman and who was our sage throughout the run-up to the last presidential, or the last but one presidential election 8 years ago. And I'd love to hear his voice again, assuming he's still prepared to work for us for nothing. Okay, here's my number, 0844 499 1000. That's the number to call me. Nadir has called me and Benton has called me, but I don't think I'm able to get them right now. So finally, we made it on to the American elections to add to the mix. The one thing I definitely agreed with Scott Stiegler about was that Trump runs out of the same trap as the result of the referendum in Britain last week, the result of the Jeremy Corbyn leadership election, the result of the rise of some left-wing parties and mayors in particular, the mayor of Paris, the mayor of Madrid, the mayor of Barcelona, the mayor of Rome, the mayor of New York, all populist, anti-political class, outsider candidates, and also parties of the left and right that have been breaking all records in world politics, in European politics in particular over the last period. Trump definitely comes out of that same trap. By trap, I mean a racing trap, a dog trap. I'm giving away my background at the Hackney races. Out of the same trap, it's anti-establishment, it's hatred of the political class, it's hatred of the caste of privileged entitlement that many people feel is the defining characteristic of the people who run our politics today. So let me take some calls because I'm missing the callers. Nadir is on the line. Nadir, where are you calling from?
Hi, George. How you doing? I'm calling from Kingston, South London.
Okay, excellent. Go ahead, please, Nadir.
Nothing. I just wanted to first of all, how you doing? Everything.
I'm good. I'm happy. I'm not broken-hearted by the Iceland result. If you get what I mean.
I'm unfortunately watching it right now. Yeah, I get what you mean. I'm watching it right now. It's not looking too well, but I just wanted to just get in contact and just kind of discuss a couple of the obviously the sort of the post-Brexit issues.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, first of all, I'm obviously a British Muslim, and I'm I've been pretty much here all my life, but I'm obviously proud to be English. But obviously, I voted. Obviously, I was on the Leave side, like yourselves, and I wanted just to make the point of obviously some sort of post planning regarding what's going on at the moment, and a couple of points I wanted to make clear was. First of all, regarding immigrants, obviously, there's been a lot of sort of uproar regarding immigrants and stuff like that. But obviously, they are contributing a lot to society.
Of course.
And obviously, I would say because I've had a lot of things on Facebook going on saying, immigrants, blah 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 blah. Well, look, there's no issue at all with keeping every immigrant that's here currently at the moment. Number two, more importantly, actually, I believe, second point is more importantly than the first regarding the immigrants is. Take in all the refugees, that need help because with them it's a life and death situation, and obviously they are, there's people that that are coming across, to England or wherever it is in Europe, who are obviously in a life and death situation, which is to me is more important than the first issue. But thirdly, I would say is why are these people coming across? Why are these people refugees to begin with? I mean, obviously the reason why they're refugees is because governments feel the need to meddle into other people's affairs, especially in the Middle East, for financial gain, such as oil, gas. I mean, it's no coincidence that the top 4 countries, i.e. Iraq, Iran, even Venezuela, let's throw them in there as well, Russia, are constantly on the news, saying they're all corrupt and all that. I mean, and let's not forget that the European Union, they're not exactly, they haven't exactly been, eradicated wars and stuff like that. I mean, they're happy to obviously get involved in them because guess what? All the banks, all the major banks in Sydney are all JP Morgan, and they obviously back the Remain campaign. Are happy to get in and dig their money into the oil and stuff like that.
No, sure. Look, I couldn't put it better than you've been putting it. Let me just, as it were, reframe it just a little bit.
Sure.
I think you and I both agree, and any moral person agrees, that the responsibility to a refugee is absolute. There's no hiding place from that moral responsibility, even if it were not the case, which in our case, unfortunately, it is, that you were the people causing the refugee flow in the first place. 80% of the refugees are from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And you don't have to be a genius to work out what these three countries have in common. They have in common that we have been attacking them, invading them, or in the case of Syria, giving money and weapons to people who are tearing the country apart. So you have an absolute responsibility to take your fair share of refugees. Equally, every state, or it wouldn't be a state, has a right to decide who immigrates to their country.
Yeah.
Unless you believe in no borders.
Of course.
And there are some liberals who believe that, and there are some very far left people who believe that, but the vast majority of people in every country realize that if you are a state and you have a government, that state, that government has to control who comes into your country, and the corollary, who you can deport from your country. You can't be told by someone else that you must allow an unlimited number of people. It's not unlimited so far, but it is theoretically unlimited. Tomorrow, the entire population of Slovakia, to name but one, could come and work in England. Now, what would that do to Slovakia, and what would it do to the people, whatever their name was, whatever color they were, whatever religion they were, the people who were already living here? It would put half of them out of a job, because the Slovakian workers are ready to work for far less than the workers in Britain are. It's obvious.
Yes. Well, no, I agree with you. I completely agree. I just wanted to. The reason why I was saying that is I wanted to make the point, because obviously I've been saying a lot of echoing a lot of your sentiments. But obviously, I'm getting a lot of backlash on Facebook.
Well, I'll tell you what, Nadir, I need to press on, but I'll tell you what to say to them. This is not about race. The last thing in the world this is about is race. Because the East European, South European workers are all white. This is an immigration policy that is an overwhelmingly white immigration policy. So there's no issue of race. And in fact, many of the workers here on the lowest pay, who are most directly threatened by free movement of labour, are Asian and black workers in Britain, who are having to compete with an unending supply of cheaper Eastern European labour. Tell them that, Nadir. Let me go to Rhys in South Wales, Carmarthenshire. Rhys, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, sir. Go ahead.
There was 2 points, if you would allow me to make them. One of them is on Jeremy, and the other one's on Welsh and Scottish independence. I'm a Jeremy Corbyn fan, a big supporter, the causes he has, etc. And like yourself as well, the political views that you both share, I completely agree with. I think what's happening, though, is that when you come to particularly the valleys of Wales, and the areas that I come from, is that Jeremy's message is lost. The only thing that they see on the BBC and the ITV and all these other places, and the media and the rubbish that gets put out in the papers, is it tends to be on Jeremy's foreign policy issues. Where there was a time, when I was a kid, I remember marching in the strikes with my father and with my grandmother. And I remember that the tone was different. We wanted jobs, we want good jobs, we want good pay, we want a good NHS, and we want a good system for working people. And I don't think that is reaching the end user. And now, you can blame the media, but in actual fact, I mean, if you really break it down, these people who are sacking themselves from the shadow cabinet, which is great, people like Chris Bryant from the Rhondda, he's now sending a message up to the people in the Rhondda. The people in the Rhondda don't want Chris Bryant, and they didn't want his Remain campaign either.
No, and they didn't want the Labour candidate in the Welsh Assembly elections either, because Plaid Cymru won that one. Right. Leave won the referendum, so I'm not sure what Chris Bryant's got in the way of moral authority to be lecturing, indeed insulting, Jeremy Corbyn.
I agree, and you look at the Canucks as well. From the area that I was from, the Glencorrog, Aberafon, Talbot way, Kinnock was completely ousted there. They didn't want to remain. A staunch Labour area, and they didn't buy his campaign.
But why is that not his fault, but it's Jeremy's fault?
Well, it is his fault. That's the whole point, is that the message that Jeremy's giving to his MPs isn't getting through to the electorate, and who do you blame? You've got to blame the MPs. But one thing with Plaid, and particularly Scotland, which I couldn't really speak about in depth, but what I find with Plaid is that the Welsh Independence Party, they're redefining what it means to be Welsh. And they're doing this and they're alienating other Welsh people. And what I mean by that is that if you're not categorised, people feel this. I speak to many people in the community, and I was a part of the Labour Leave movement. I would hand out flyers, etc. But what I find with Plaid is if you're not in their category, if you're not some people who don't speak Welsh perhaps, and have born here, bred here, lived here, and have generations of family who come from here, they feel alienated by Plaid Cymru. I think they're redefining the boundaries of what it is to be Welsh. So they're forming this tribalism that's dividing parts of the country, and I think that's what's happening with Scotland as well.
Well, to some extent, but the defining point was the Plaid support for Remain, which was very heavily defeated, including in places that they had just won seats in May in the Assembly elections. Listen, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Rhys. It's only because I've run out of time that I need to say goodbye. Carl says, George, after listening to JC speak, must say he ticks all my boxes, but unfortunately too many people are looking and not listening. Well, I mean, the truth is, Carl, does Labour have someone else that would do better? I mean, I heard a comedian on here earlier, former advisor to Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband. They did well, didn't they? And I heard her say that we need a candidate that can reconnect with the Northern Heartlands. And then she proceeded to name two possibilities, one of whom has never been heard of anywhere by anyone in the Northern Heartlands, and the other one from whom the Northern Heartlands would run a mile. West Stand Jim says, George, would you accept a position in the shadow cabinet? Well, I'd need to get back into Parliament first. You have to be in Parliament to be in the shadow cabinet. Now look, the Metro I pick up every day, and I'm not saying that as some kind of advertiser. I genuinely pick up and read the Metro every day. So it's a pleasure to look ahead to tomorrow's top stories with the assistant editor of the paper, Chris Cowley. Chris, welcome.
Hello, George.
Now, I mean, if this show is anything to go by, you're not going to be short of things to write about in the paper tomorrow.
Well, no, it's only really one story in town at the moment. So, it's our main story tomorrow is about the day of farce at Westminster. We've even picked up on
which particular farce? Run me across the stage.
Well, I suppose it's a case of we picked up on somebody who put something out on Twitter about it being a bit of a resignation bingo day, where you could just put the names up and then start scoring them off.
Except nobody knows who they are. Am I not right?
Well, that's right. I mean, we've struggled as well. We've saying, well, who's he? Who's she?
As I put it, a group of people whose names you don't know resigning from jobs you didn't know they had.
Exactly. Yeah.
It is farcical. And what about the Tory side? Have you made much of that tomorrow?
Well, we've obviously added their sort of level of confusion as well, but it is mainly about Jeremy Corbyn at the moment. Although it's a bit, I'm afraid it is more of a sideshow, Jeremy Corbyn, but it's still very important.
It is, but what about on the Tory side? Who are the runners and riders? You're going to know that by Thursday, aren't you?
Well, I understand Sajid Javid is putting his name forward tonight with and I haven't got the name in front of me, but
that's interesting. I didn't expect that.
Yeah, there's some sort of plan on that, but
they're all running with running mates, aren't they? I mean, this is a new thing. People used to run for office on their own, but now that they've got a running mate.
Yes.
I mean, they're talking about Boris with Michael Gove, and Theresa May with George Osborne.
Well, it looks like they all need to have some friends somewhere.
Yes, exactly.
Certainly to watch their backs at the moment. That's what it feels like.
Now, are you going to have the England football score? I don't want to rub this in, Chris, but there's now 76 minutes played, and England are still losing 2-1 to Iceland. Are you going to print the paper with black edges around?
We have various scenarios open to us at the moment, and so I think we got 3 different versions of the front page with that on. But at the moment, it looks like they're going out. We've noticed as well. Somebody had tweeted out that maybe Joe Hart could run for Prime Minister as he's engineering our exit out of Europe.
Exactly. Well, what about my joke that you must never write Iceland off because they beat Tesco, Sainsbury and Lidl on the way to these finals? Yeah. That's quite a good one, actually. Have you got room for any non-political news? Anything else we need to know?
No, really, our paper's quite tight tomorrow, so we have struggled somewhat to
find room for anything else.
It's just going to give us. It's just so much of it. It's just incredible. It's been quite an exciting day yet again.
Yeah. Well, I'll be picking it up as normal. Thanks for that. That's Chris Cowley, the assistant editor of Metro. That was the paper review with Metro. Get your fix of news, sport, and showbiz every weekday morning. Pick up your free copy of Metro tomorrow. We spoke to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Call Saul is filmed. He says that he sees Saul out and about regularly. I got the impression he was to the right of me, but that's no bad thing in terms of radio. But we do want to hear from a more plural set of American voices over the course of the next few months as we follow the US presidential election. Nonetheless, Scott, I think, was correct in locating the rise of Donald Trump from the same set of circumstances that we've seen the rise of Brexit, the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, the rise of radical mayors in many of the great European cities. It is discontent. This is the summer of our discontent. Let's talk to Amanda on that. She's on a mobile somewhere. Amanda, where are you calling from?
Hi, George. I'm calling from Manchester.
Okay, welcome. Go ahead. Please tell me what you think.
What it was, I just wondered, when we actually do leave the EU, what effect is that going to have on the day-to-day life of people? For example, I'm a teacher, and what benefit, if any, will that have to me?
Well, there is a benefit, I think, in having a democracy where you are only affected by laws that are passed by people that you elected or can remove. So if I was a school teacher teaching civics or modern studies, that's one point I would want to definitely make. As Mr. Ben used to say, if you can't remove the people who are passing laws that affect your life, then you're not living in a democracy. There will, over time, be changes. You will have to, if you wanted to go and teach in Bulgaria or Portugal, you'll have to get a work permit from the Portuguese and the Bulgarians in order to do so. It doesn't mean you won't be able to do that, because if they need an English teacher and they don't have one for a job, then they'll give you a work permit, just like if you go to work in the United States now. Or many, many other countries that are not in the EU. You need to get a work permit to work there, and that's only fair. I mean, nobody has an automatic right to go and live and work and claim benefits and get a house and all that in somebody else's country. I think that there's nothing wrong with countries having a sovereign right to decide who's in their country. What would be wrong would be somebody making a racist decision that you were going to take this person but not that person because of the color of their skin or the ethnicity that they came from. But as long as we have a just and fair immigration system, then I think it will be a benefit to us. If you had Jeremy Corbyn in Downing Street, you'd get more money spent on schools, and that would help you and help the children up in Manchester too. So, I mean, that will depend on our own people. I mean, I always said during the course of this campaign, don't overestimate the civilizing nature of the European Union, and don't underestimate our own people. We are capable, and have many times in the past, of electing governments that will look after our people and make progress in the right direction. How's that?
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Francis.
Amanda, thank you very much for calling. Now, Benton in Merton has been waiting a long time to get on the air with me. I apologize for that, Benton. I hope it's not too late now, but please give me your advice, give me your views.
Good evening, George, and I'd like to thank the team that's working with you this evening for giving me the opportunity to come on air.
Very kind of you, thanks.
Could I just correct the pronunciation? It's Denton, D for David, Denton.
I beg your pardon. I do beg your pardon. Denton in Merton.
That's correct.
It's poetic enough as it is. Go ahead.
I thank you. Actually, what I'd like to speak about is the media blackout, or the apparent media blackout, of the disability issues. I'm a 60-year-old black man in a wheelchair, and since the 7th of June, when the debates for the referendum kicked in, there's not been one person in a wheelchair on any of the debates or TV debates that have been broadcasted. There's also not been any views or opinions taken from visibly disabled people anywhere. Now, I have been monitoring it. I was actually at the first debate that David Cameron and Nigel Farage attended on the ITV network.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Called them out.
By the way, I wasn't asked for my view on any of these programs either. So there's clearly been discrimination going on. In your case, you're saying that the discrimination has been against disabled people.
It's been blatant.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that I noticed that because I didn't watch any of it, so I wouldn't have known one way or the other. But
unfortunately, I monitor it because of the way that I was treated.
Yeah.
At the very first debate.
Oh, you were there and you had a bad time.
I was there, George. This is what I'm talking about.
No, I know you were there, but I didn't know you had a bad time. Go on, tell me about it.
I was the person who was in charge of the production team leader actually came to me afterwards and apologized for the same thing that I'm speaking about now, the non-representation of people with disabilities throughout the whole now of that debate that took place in the referendum.
Right.
And because of that, George, me being a black man, I voted to take us out of Europe to cause the mayhem and chaos that you're presently seeing, on the basis that it allowed myself and other people who have been on the receiving end of austerity to come up for some air. That's what we're doing now. And whatever takes place, yes, the fallout is going to be possibly detrimental to a lot of things. But within this period of chaos, maybe, just maybe, able-bodied people might take a glance over their shoulder and wonder, where are all the disabled people gone? Have we been alienated, obliterated from the media, the press? It's angered me so much, George. Even when I came out of the TV debate that took place, the very first one on ITV, an amazing thing took place. I came outside and I lost my rag trying to stop or trying to intervene with other people that were being interviewed to go on different press networks. And they literally physically tried to move me in my wheelchair out of the way so that I couldn't be heard.
It's never a good look trying to move somebody out of the way in their wheelchair. Well, look, Denton.
Ironically, as I was leaving, George, Laura Koonsberg turned up. And I outlined to her what went down. Now, she's from the BBC, and she turned up after the debate had finished.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, are all these people working in collusion? So I thought, let me watch it, the next debate, and see if they can put a wheelchair back into the audience and have a person ask a question. Because I got vetted for over a month by police checks and all the rest of it, on the basis thinking that I'm going to be in an audience that was going to be live to the host and David Cameron and Nigel Farage. And it was rigged from start to finish, George.
Well, you're not going to get an argument from me on that, Denton. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for allowing me.
And you'll always be allowed to come up for air here on my show. I give you that assurance. Rhys Bach says, George Galloway on Talk Radio just made my night. Big thanks. Thank you, Rhys. I've seen your picture before on my Twitter. I've got a lot of people following me on Twitter, more than 250,000, and more than 500,000 on Facebook. And my stuff on Facebook in particular is growing and growing. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching the videos that my wonderful wife makes. I just do the talking. All the rest is done by her, and they're more and more successful. So follow me on both, on Twitter and on Facebook. Let's take another tweet. The Benite coup, imagine a Benite coup against Jeremy Corbyn, is an exercise in self-defeat, exposing the divide between the Parliamentary Labour Party and the members. Clearly the wishes of the latter should be realised. That's from Martin O'Byrne. Martin, I think you're right, at least I hope you're right. We'll see now, because after this motion of no confidence is passed tomorrow, the natural concomitant is a challenge for the leadership, and Jeremy will be on the ballot, and we'll see who they put up against him, and we'll see who the members choose. But if the members choose to send Jeremy Corbyn back as leader again, what will have been achieved by this gigantic self-disfiguring reason, or exercise rather? Now, Richard in Worcestershire says, George, Alan Johnson headed the Labour Remain campaign. Why isn't he being asked what went wrong? He is a great chap, but I think it's unfair that Jeremy Corbyn is getting all this flack. Indeed, it's more than unfair. Let's look at what is being said here. What is being said is that Jeremy Corbyn didn't do enough to persuade the people of Britain that they should stay in the European Union. But the people who voted to leave the European Union were people of all classes, supporters of all parties, and all of their leaders, with the exception of Farage, failed to deliver the kind of share of the vote for the Remain camp that they would have been hoping for. Even Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the SNP. 37% of SNP voters, and the SNP is as pro-EU a party as exists anywhere in the European Union. They are fanatically pro-EU, but 37% of their voters voted to leave, which is roughly the share of the Labour vote that voted to leave. But it's Corbyn that's to blame. Secondly, these Labour politicians that are now risking the total destruction of their own party and the total destruction of the rights of the working people they're supposed to be defending, these people failed in almost every case, with the exception of London, to deliver their own constituencies for the Remain camp. So what does that say about them? If Corbyn should step down, why shouldn't they step down? Margaret Hodge, Dame Margaret Hodge, or Duchess or Baroness, whatever she is, she's the one that's tabled this motion of no confidence. She's the MP for Barking and Dagenham, where well over 65% of the people voted leave. So why is Jeremy Corbyn to blame? Why didn't Margaret Hodge persuade her voters in Barking and Dagenham that they should have voted Remain? The truth is, nobody could have sold the EU to huge tracts of this country. And the poorer you were, the less likely you were to vote for the European Union, because why should you? If the European Union, don't talk to me about freedom of movement and the ability to get through a quick queue at the airport in Milan for vast numbers of British people. That's absolutely meaningless. These people, 2/3 of all council house tenants, 2/3, that's 66% of council house tenants, of housing association tenants, voted to leave the EU. Nobody, except Jesus, could have persuaded them to vote for the EU. It's not Jeremy Corbyn's fault that the lived experience of the EU, of millions of our people, is a negative one. And not just a negative one on one track. It suits the Remainiacs to say it's all about immigration and racism. Well, it isn't. Nobody could be less racist than me. Nobody could be more internationalist than me. So it wasn't about race or nationality for me. I hate nationalism of all kinds. I hate Scottish nationalism. I hate British nationalism. It's not about nationalism or race. It's about democracy for me. The right to control our own affairs. It's about the neoliberal brand of finance capitalism that we live under, for me, that has left half of the children in Greece hungry, half of the young people in Spain unemployed, which has left roughly the same kind of figures of minority ethnic communities in countries like ours unemployed. It's this neoliberal orthodoxy under which we live, against which I rail and against which I fight. And what I wanted to do was send a message to the neoliberal prevailing orthodoxy that we aren't going to take it anymore. We may all have a different view of where we want to go next, but we all share the view that where we are now is rank. It's not fit for purpose, not just for 17 million people in Britain. But if we'd had a referendum last Thursday across the whole of the European Union, asking people would they like to join this European Union with the experience that they have, the lived experience that they have, the answer would have been overwhelmingly no. Now, none of that is Jeremy Corbyn's fault. Corbyn opposed all of this. He opposed all these wars. He opposed the austerity. He opposed the bankers. He opposed the lack of democracy in the European Union. He's not to blame. If you'd listened to him, we wouldn't be in this mess now, because we would have chosen a different path. Now, to see the name, as I just have, in one of these texts from Marta, the Benite coup, is particularly hard for me to bear. Because I and Jeremy Corbyn, from the middle of the 1970s until the day of his demise and until now, we have been followers and believers in the late and great Tony Benn. And if Tony Benn can see what happened in the Labour Party over the last couple of days, if he's up there looking down on all of this, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that that great father should have to look down on what his son has done and is a central part of. Maybe I'm being sentimental, but I hope Tony can't see it. Anyway, the ball's on the slates now. England are out of the European Championships at the hands of the mighty Iceland. Jeremy Corbyn's facing a leadership challenge against who knows whom.